So the United States Senate just passed a bill that would have saved America, not saved it from Canada, not saved it from the Democratic Commerce Alliance, saved it from itself. The Economic Sovereignty and Competitiveness Act, the bipartisan legislation that had been building co-sponsors across months of crisis, amended after each new episode of self-inflicted damage, refined through hearings where university presidents testified about brain drains and defense officials testified about mineral stockpile countdowns, and business leaders testified about supply chains rerouted to competitors, passed the Senate with 68 votes to 32, 68 senators, 24 Republicans, and 44 Democrats voted to require the administration to submit a comprehensive proposal for engagement with the DCA, restore diplomatic relations with Canada, reopen academic collaboration, address the defense supply chain crisis, and begin preliminary discussions about American observer status in the economic framework that now encompasses 60% of the global economy. The bill was America's institutional immune response, the legislative system doing what it was designed to do when an executive branch damages national interests, intervening, correcting, offering a path back to sanity. The bill reached the president's desk on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Donald Trump had vetoed it. And what happened next, what Carney did in response, what it means for the possibility of American re-engagement with the global economy, and what Warren Buffett said about the specific kind of loss that cannot be reversed, will define not just this crisis, but the trajectory of American economic history for the next generation. Let me walk you through what the bill actually contained, because what Trump vetoed is as important as the act of vetoing it. The Economic Sovereignty and Competitiveness Act was not a surrender. It was not a capitulation to Canada or to the DCA. It was, by the assessment of every trade lawyer, foreign policy analyst, and economic strategist who reviewed it, the most carefully constructed piece of bipartisan legislation to emerge from the American Congress in over a decade. A bill designed to give the administration maximum flexibility to negotiate while creating the institutional framework for engagement that the administration had failed to produce on its own. Section 1 required the administration to submit, within 60 days, a comprehensive proposal for American engagement with the DCA, not membership, not application, just a proposal for engagement, a starting point, a document that would articulate what the United States wanted and what it was willing to offer. Section 2 restored academic collaboration with Canadian and DCA institutions, reopening the research partnerships, the clinical trial networks, the faculty exchanges that the university executive order had severed. Section 3 established a congressional oversight mechanism for trade policy with allied nations, a check on future unilateral actions that had characterized the crisis. Section 4 created an independent commission to assess the total damage caused by the crisis, economic, diplomatic, military, academic, medical, and report its findings to Congress and the public within 120 days. Section 5 authorized preliminary discussions about American observer status in the DCA, not membership, just observer status, the most minimal form of institutional engagement available, the diplomatic equivalent of pulling up a chair at the edge of the table. And Section 6 required the restoration of diplomatic relations with Canada within 90 days, the reopening of the embassy that had been closed for the first time in 158 years. That is what the president vetoed, not a treaty of submission, not a concession of American sovereignty. A structured, bipartisan, carefully limited set of steps designed to begin, just begin, the process of American re-engagement with a global economic order that was built specifically because America refused to engage. The bill offered the administration more flexibility, more time, and more political cover than any foreign policy legislation in recent memory. Its authors had deliberately avoided language that could be characterized as critical of the president, had included provisions that protected executive authority, and had framed every requirement as a national security necessity rather than a political correction. They had, in every way available to them, built a bridge that the president could walk across without losing face, and the president set it on fire. Trump's stated reason for the veto was a single sentence in the veto message. This bill would surrender American sovereignty to a foreign trade bloc led by a hostile government. The characterization was false on every level. The bill surrendered no sovereignty, required no membership, and characterized no government as an ally or an adversary. But the falseness was, by this point, almost beside the point. The actual reason for the veto, as communicated by 4 senior White House officials speaking on background within hours of the signing, was simpler and more damaging. The president refused to sign any legislation that implicitly acknowledged the DCA's legitimacy. Even observer status, the most minimal form of engagement, carrying no obligations, no commitments, and no concessions, was, in the president's view, an admission that the DCA mattered. And the president, after 18 months of calling the DCA a scam, calling its numbers fake, calling its leader a joke and a liar, could not bring himself to sign a document that treated the alliance as a real institution worthy of American engagement. The veto was not strategic. It was psychological. It was the final expression of a worldview that had driven every error from the beginning, the belief that acknowledging reality constitutes defeat. The bill asked the president to acknowledge that the DCA existed. he could not do it. Inside the White House, the decision was not unanimous. It was, according to 5 officials who spoke within 48 hours, the most contentious internal debate of the entire crisis. The Secretary of State argued against the veto in a meeting that lasted over 2 hours, presenting an analysis showing that the bill's provisions were structured to maximize presidential flexibility and that signing it would be interpreted internationally as a sign of strategic maturity rather than weakness. The Treasury Secretary concurred, noting that the financial markets, which had been pricing in the possibility of American re-engagement since the bill gained co-sponsors, would react severely to a veto. The National Security Advisor presented the defense supply chain data for what he described as the final time, the 11-month mineral stockpile countdown that was now at 9 months and falling, the F-35 production delays, the guided missile component shortages, and argued that the bill's restoration of academic and research collaboration alone justified signing it. Even the Commerce Secretary, the same Howard Lutnick who had been publicly dismantled by Carney in the debate months earlier, argued that the bill represented the least costly path to re-engagement available. The president listened, and then according to 3 people present, he said, "If I sign this, I'm admitting Carney won. I'm admitting the DCA is real. I'm admitting everything I've said for 18 months was wrong. I won't do it." Veto. One advisor speaking anonymously afterwards said, "The entire room understood at that moment that the decision was not about the bill, the DCA, or the national interest. It was about one man's inability to admit he was wrong. That's it. That's the entire reason 330 million people are now locked out of the global economy, because one person could not say I was wrong." The veto override attempt that followed was, in its procedural mechanics and its human drama, the most politically devastating sequence of the entire crisis because it demonstrated that America's failure was not a failure of institutions, but a failure of 3 individual human beings under pressure. The override required 67 votes, 2/3 of the Senate. The bill had passed with 68, 1 vote of margin. Trump's team had 72 hours between the veto and the override vote to find the pressure points, and they found them with the ruthless efficiency of a political operation that had nothing left to offer the country, but could still threaten individual senators. 3 Republican senators who had voted for the bill were targeted. The first, a senator from a state with a major military installation, was told that the installation's next funding cycle would be reviewed if she voted to override, a threat to jobs in her state delivered through the Defense Department's Legislative Affairs Office. The second, a senator facing a primary challenge from the president's wing of the party, was told that the president would endorse his challenger publicly if he voted for the override. The third, the most senior of the 3, was summoned to the White House for a private meeting that lasted 40 minutes and whose contents have not been disclosed, but whose outcome was immediately visible. She emerged and told her staff she would vote to sustain the veto. The override vote was 65 to 35, 2 votes short. 3 senators who had voted to save their country's economic future changed their votes under pressure from the president, whose economic decisions had created the need for saving the margin of permanent exclusion from the global economy, 2 votes. 2 votes stood between the United States and its path back to relevance. 2 votes that were changed not by argument or principle, but by institutional threats and political intimidation. 2 votes stood between the United States and its path back to relevance, and those 2 votes were changed not by argument, not by analysis, not by a competing vision for American engagement, but by threats to a military base, a primary endorsement, and a 40-minute meeting whose contents may never be known. The American reaction to the veto and the failed override was unlike anything in the previous 11 episodes because for the first time, the damage was not inflicted by the president on Canada. It was inflicted by the president on his own country's institutional capacity to recover. Previous episodes had produced anger directed outward at Canada, at the DCA, at the situation. This one produced anger directed inward, at the president, at the 3 senators, at the system that allowed 3 pressure flip votes to determine the economic trajectory of 330 million people. The senior Republican sponsor of the bill held a press conference that was broadcast nationally, and her voice broke twice during a statement that lasted 4 minutes. "We built this bill over months. We consulted with every stakeholder, business, labor, defense, academia, agriculture, energy. We designed it to give the president every possible flexibility. We structured it so he could sign it without admitting fault. We did everything we could to make this easy, and he vetoed it anyway. Not because the bill was flawed, because acknowledging reality felt like losing, and now because of that veto, because of 3 senators who changed their votes under pressure, the path back is gone. Not harder, not longer, gone." The Business Roundtable issued a statement that was 1 sentence long, the shortest statement in the organization's history. The veto of the Economic Sovereignty and Competitiveness Act is the most consequential act of economic self-destruction by an American president in the modern era. The governor of Michigan, whose state had been an energy emergency for months, said the president just vetoed the bill that would have turned our lights back on. "I don't have a speech for that. I just have a question. When does this end? The reaction from American citizens, not politicians, not business leaders, not analysts, but ordinary people, was the dimension of the response that no previous episode had produced at this scale, because for the first time, the crisis felt personal in a way that every American could grasp. The bill had been covered extensively by local media as it gained co-sponsors. Local newspapers and border states had run features on what the bill's provisions would mean for energy prices, for manufacturing jobs, for military installations, for prescription drug costs. When the veto hit, the coverage was not about geopolitics. It was about heating bills. It was about factory schedules. It was about whether the naval shipyard in a senator state would receive its next titanium delivery. Phone lines in congressional offices across the country were overwhelmed. The Senate switchboard reported the highest volume of constituent calls in its recorded history, exceeding even the peaks during previous national crises. The calls were not partisan. They were desperate. One Senate aide described the calls from her state. They're not asking about the DCA or about Carney or about trade policy. They're asking, when will my gas price go down? When will the hospital construction restart? When will my son's factory get the parts it needs to stay open? And the answer after the veto is, we don't know, because the mechanism that would have begun addressing those questions was just vetoed by the president. Protests, small, scattered, and notable, more for their demographic diversity than their size, appeared in 11 American cities within 48 hours. In Buffalo, a crowd of approximately 3,000 people gathered at the Peace Bridge, which connects the United States to Canada and which had been functionally dormant since the diplomatic severance. They held signs that read, "Open the door," a phrase that would, within hours, take on a terrible irony when Carney announced that the door was about to be locked permanently. State governors, 23 of them, including 8 Republicans, issued a joint letter to the president calling the veto an act of economic abandonment and requesting an emergency meeting to discuss state-level options for engagement with the DCA that would bypass the federal government entirely. The letter noted that American states collectively had the legal authority under existing trade law to establish limited commercial relationships with foreign entities, and that several states were already exploring this option. The governor of New York said in a press conference, if the federal government will not engage with the 60% of the global economy that exists inside the DCA, then New York will explore every legal avenue to engage on its own. My obligation is to the people of this state, not to the pride of a president who would rather lock them out of the global economy than admit he was wrong. The spectacle of American states attempting to conduct independent foreign economic policy, a constitutional gray area that would normally be unthinkable, was in itself a measure of how completely the federal government had lost the confidence of its own constituent parts. And then Carney responded. And for the first time in 12 episodes, his response was not a soundbite, not a countermove, not a judo flip. It was something heavier, something that carried the weight of finality rather than the sharpness of strategy. He appeared at a joint press conference in Geneva with the heads of state of 6 DCA member nations and the Secretary General of the organization's newly established permanent secretariat, and he announced that the Democratic Commerce Alliance would formalize its institutional structure from a multilateral framework agreement into a permanent treaty organization under international law. What was not visible in the press conference but was confirmed afterward by 3 members of the Canadian delegation was that Carney had personally argued against the unanimous consent clause in internal DCA discussions prior to the veto. He had advocated for a 2/3 majority requirement instead, a lower bar that would have preserved a more realistic path for future American entry. His argument, according to officials who were present, was that the DCA's long-term interests were best served by leaving open the possibility of American participation, even if the current administration made that participation impossible. He believed, genuinely, persistently, against the growing consensus of his own alliance, that a future America would eventually seek to join and that the door should remain crackable, even if it was closed. The veto changed his position when the override failed by 2 votes. When it became clear that America's own institutional self-correction mechanism had been defeated by presidential pressure on 3 senators, Carney withdrew his objection to unanimous consent. According to one official, he said, if their own Congress can't get them through the door, it's not our job to hold it open. That was the moment the unanimous consent clause became the treaty's final article. The man who had spent 18 months keeping the door open decided in the hour after the override failed to let it close. The specifics of the treaty carried the institutional gravity of something designed to outlast not just this crisis, but the lifetimes of everyone involved in it. The DCA Treaty of Permanent Organization established a binding institutional charter, a constitutional document for the alliance that codified its governance structure, its decision-making processes, its dispute resolution mechanisms, and its membership requirements. It created a permanent secretariat headquartered in Geneva, staffed by over 2,000 international civil servants with operational authority to administer the alliance's trade, financial, defense, academic, and healthcare systems. It converted existing framework agreements, the trade facilitation platform, the financial clearing mechanism, the defense procurement framework, the academic alliance, the healthcare cooperation system, from bilateral and multilateral agreements that could theoretically be renegotiated into treaty-level obligations that were binding under international law and that could not be modified without the consent of two-thirds of member nations. And it included the provision that would define the structural future of global economics for decades. Article 23, the membership clause requiring unanimous consent of all existing member nations for the admission of any new member. Article 23, unanimous consent. Let me explain what that means in practice because the practical implications are what make Carney's announcement not just a policy move, but the closing of a door that may never reopen. Under the framework agreement structure, joining the DCA had been relatively straightforward. A nation submitted an application, met the membership criteria, and was admitted through a process that required a simple majority of existing members. That was the door that had been opened throughout the entire crisis. The door that France's president had referenced when he said America was welcome when it is ready. The door that the Economic Sovereignty and Competitiveness Act would have begun the process of walking through. That door is now gone. Under Article 23, any new member must be approved by every single existing member nation, all 22 of them, the original 20 plus the 2 nations that joined during the treaty ratification process. Any single member can block any applicant. That means Canada can block the United States, France can block the United States, Germany, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, Australia, India, Brazil, any nation that was insulted, threatened, mocked, or economically coerced by the American government over the past 18 months can individually prevent the United States from ever joining the alliance its own behavior created. The door was open. The bill would have started the walk through it. The president vetoed the bill and the walk triggered the treaty, and the treaty locked the door from 22 different angles. Then Carney delivered the line. He was standing at the podium in Geneva having just announced the permanent institutionalization of the alliance that had replaced American economic centrality, and a reporter asked whether the United States could still join the DCA in the future. Carney's expression was not the controlled smile of the joke episode, not the clinical precision of the confrontation in Rio, not the quiet amusement of previous moments. It was something closer to sadness, the expression of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say, and who understood that it was not, despite everything, a cause for celebration. He spoke 8 words. The door was open. It no longer is. 8 words, and the silence that followed was the heaviest of the entire series. Not the shocked silence of the confrontation, not the stunned silence of we already are. The silence of finality, of a future that was possible yesterday and is not possible today. Of a door that was open for 18 months, open through every insult, every ultimatum, every sleeping incident, every useless and every joke and every liar. A door that remained open because the DCA's charter explicitly welcomed American participation, because Carney personally ensured that the framework preserved a path for American engagement, because 20 nations understood that the global economy ultimately needed the United States to participate even if the current president would not. And that door is now closed. Not by Canada, not by the DCA. By the veto of a bill that would have been the first step through it, the door closed because the president of the country on the other side chose to close it, and the treaty locked it because with the door closed by America's own hand, the remaining members saw no reason to leave it unlocked for a nation that had spent 18 months refusing to walk through it. Warren Buffett's response arrived the following morning, and his tone was different from every previous commentary. Quieter, more measured, almost elegant. He did not open with a framework or a principle. He opened with a sentence that carried the weight of genuine sorrow. I am 94 years old, and I have never been more worried about the future of the country I love. He paused, not because of what Canada did, not because of what the DCA built, because of what we did to ourselves. He then introduced what he called the bridge burner's dilemma, the specific strategic catastrophe that occurs when a leader destroys the mechanism of recovery rather than just the current position. He said that in 70 years of business, he had watched companies lose markets, lose advantages, lose customers, lose talented people. Those losses, however painful, were recoverable, because the mechanisms of recovery still existed. The market was still there to be re-entered. The customers were still there to be re-won. The talent pipeline was still there to be rebuilt. The losses were bad, but the paths back were intact. What Trump did today, Buffett said, is categorically different from everything he has done before. Everything before today was a loss. Today is the destruction of the mechanism of recovery. He didn't lose a position. He vetoed the path back to a position. And in doing so, he triggered the treaty that eliminates the path entirely. This is not a setback. This is structural permanence. The difference is the difference between missing a train and burning the station. Buffett elaborated with the patient granularity that had defined his analysis throughout the crisis. He said that every previous error, from the resignation demand, to the sleeping, to the steel ultimatum, to the Lutnick debate, to every insult and mockery and denial, had been painful, costly, and self-defeating. But they were all in principle reversible. A new president could have apologized for the resignation demand. A new administration could have lifted the steel tariff. A new commerce secretary could have engaged substantively with the DCA. A new diplomatic approach could have restored the relationship. The door was open. The bill was the institutional mechanism for beginning that reversal. The legislation that would have created the framework for a future administration, or even this administration in a moment of clarity, to begin the process of re-engagement. And the president vetoed it. The veto didn't just close the door today, Buffett said. It triggered the event, the treaty formalization, the unanimous consent clause that closes the door structurally, permanently, for the foreseeable future. The bill was the fire extinguisher. The president threw it out the window. And then the building burned down. And now the fire extinguisher is on the ground outside and the building is ashes. And someone is going to have to explain to 330 million people why the fire extinguisher was thrown out the window by the person who was supposed to use it. Buffett went deeper with a specificity that reflected the gravity of the moment. He said that Article 23, the unanimous consent clause, created a mathematical reality that made American entry into the DCA functionally impossible for the foreseeable future. The United States had, over the course of 18 months, personally insulted the leaders of at least 12 DCA member nations. It had imposed economic damage on at least 15. It had called the alliance's documented achievements a lie. It had mocked the military capabilities of nations whose defense frameworks were now integrated into the DCA. It had attacked the academic institutions of nations whose universities were now part of the DCA academic alliance. Each of these nations now held an individual veto over American membership. You don't need 22 nations to block you, Buffett said. You need one. And this administration has given at least a dozen of them reason to. The door isn't just locked. It's locked 22 times, and each lock requires a separate key that a separate nation must choose to turn. The probability that all 22 will simultaneously agree to admit the nation that spent 18 months insulting them is, to use a technical term, zero. He paused, or close enough to zero, that the distinction doesn't matter for any planning horizon shorter than a generation. Buffett's closing was the most personal and most devastating of the entire crisis. He addressed not the policy implications or the strategic analysis, but the human cost. The cost of the 330 million Americans who would live with the consequences of the veto for decades. There are children in America today who will grow up in an economy that is permanently excluded from the largest trade alliance in human history, he said. Not because they chose exclusion, not because their parents chose it, because one president in one moment vetoed one bill and 3 senators changed 3 votes. Those children will pay higher prices for goods that DCA citizens buy at collective rates. They will have less access to research, to medicines, to education, to career pathways that DCA citizens take for granted. They will live in a country that was once the center of the global economy, and that chose through the veto of a single bill to stand outside the system that replaced it. That is the cost. Not a number on a spreadsheet, not a percentage of GDP. Children, futures, lives that will be smaller than they needed to be because a president could not bring himself to sign a piece of paper that acknowledged reality. He paused for several seconds. I have spent 70 years building value. I have spent the last 18 months watching value destroyed. And today, with the veto of a bill that would have begun rebuilding, I watch the mechanism of value creation itself be permanently dismantled. I do not have a framework for that. I have only grief. And the hope, the small, stubborn, possibly irrational hope that the country I love will find a way to rebuild what its president destroyed, even if that rebuilding takes longer than I have left to see it. The international reaction to the treaty formalization was muted, not because it lacked significance, but because the DCA had been operating as a de facto permanent institution for months and the treaty merely codified what already existed. The real significance was understood not by the public, but by the diplomatic and legal communities who recognized the treaty-level obligations under international law carried a permanence and a legal force that framework agreements did not. A framework can be renegotiated, amended, or abandoned through executive action. A treaty requires formal ratification, carries binding obligations, and creates legal expectations that governments cannot easily walk away from. The DCA had just become permanent in the most legally durable way available under international law, and Article 23 had just made American exclusion from that permanent structurally irrevocable without the individual consent of every nation. America had spent 18 months alienating. The specific national responses to the treaty, and particularly to Article 23, revealed the degree to which the unanimous consent clause was understood by member nations, not just as an institutional safeguard, but as a form of insurance against the instability that had characterized American policy. France's foreign minister, in a televised interview, was asked directly whether France would use its veto to block a future American application for DCA membership. His response was diplomatic in form and devastating in substance. France would evaluate any membership application on its merits, including the applicant's demonstrated commitment to multilateral cooperation, respect for allied sovereignty, and willingness to engage with documented reality. At this time, the United States would not meet those criteria. Asked when those criteria might be met, he said, when the behavior changes, not the president. The behavior? Japan's trade minister echoed the position with characteristic precision. Japan's veto under Article 23 would only be exercised if an applicant's participation would destabilize the alliance. Based on the past 18 months, we would have significant concerns. The United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary was more restrained, but equally clear. The DCA treaty reflects the maturity of an alliance that has delivered extraordinary results for its members. We will protect the integrity of that alliance with every tool the treaty provides, including Article 23. The message was uniform. The veto was not hypothetical. It was operational, and the nations that held it were prepared to use it, not out of spite, out of institutional self-preservation. Because admitting a nation that had spent 18 months demonstrating contempt for the alliance's values, achievements, and documented reality would, in the assessment of every member government, pose a greater risk to the alliance than the benefit of that nation's participation. So here is where we stand. At the moment the mechanism of return was destroyed, the treaty was signed, and the door was locked from 22 angles simultaneously. The United States Senate passed a bipartisan bill to begin the process of American re-engagement with the global economy. 68 votes, 24 Republicans. The most significant bipartisan foreign policy legislation in a generation. The president vetoed it. 3 senators changed their votes under presidential pressure. The override failed by 2 votes. And Mark Carney, who had spent 18 months leaving the door open, who had ensured that the DCA Charter welcomed American participation, who had personally communicated through diplomatic channels that the alliance wanted the United States to join, announced the permanent treaty formalization that locks the door through a unanimous consent clause that gives every insulted, threatened, and mocked member nation an individual veto over American entry. 8 words. The door was open. It no longer is. Can the United States rebuild its position in the global economy from outside a permanent treaty organization that encompasses 60% of global GDP and that requires the unanimous consent of 22 nations, at least 12 of which have specific documented personal reasons to block American entry, to admit a new member? Can a president who vetoed his own country's path back to relevance against the advice of his Secretary of State, his Treasury Secretary, his National Security Advisor, and his own Commerce Secretary, all of whom argued for signing, credibly claim to be acting in the national interest? Can the 3 senators who changed their votes under presidential pressure, one for a military base, one for a primary endorsement, one for reasons that may never be disclosed, live with the knowledge that their votes determine the economic trajectory of every American alive today and every American who will be born tomorrow? And the question that will define this crisis when historians write about it decades from now, when the DCA is a settled feature of the global landscape and the decision to exclude America is studied as one of the great inflection points of the 21st century. What happens to a nation whose president would rather lock his country out of the future than admit he was wrong about the past? 12 episodes, 12 attacks.